Following Russian intervention in Georgia and Ukraine, the NATO alliance rediscovered a sense of purpose through its old enemy, Moscow. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, the usefulness of the existence of NATO was in doubt. Yet, NATO continued to exist, and even accepted additional member states, some of which had been part of the Soviet Bloc and Warsaw Pact, and this included Latvia, Lithuania and Estonia, otherwise known as the Baltic States, which have been full members of NATO since 2004. Today, tensions with Russia have heightened, and NATO needs to be ready to defend itself from a hypothetical attack from Moscow. And with the Baltics being the next most likely target, a question must be asked: are the Baltics a liability or an asset in this tense situation? The Baltics never hesitate to insist that they are at great risk, but they spend little on their militaries. 2019 marked the first year when all the Baltic states stepped up and matched NATO's requirements of 2% defense spending as a percentage of their GDP. The total defense personnel provided by the Baltics amounts to about 57,000 personnel, with 25,000 belonging to Lithuania, 13,300 to Latvia, and 18,500 to Estonia. None of the countries possess their own battle tanks, fighter aircraft, large warships, or submarines. This certainly means the defense capabilities of these countries are questionable. In theory, the Baltics provide NATO with useful army bases. Given their precarious location, they help increase the strategic depth of NATO's defenses. Also, by being close to the important Russian cities, such as Kaliningrad and St. Petersburg, they can be good locations to launch attacks from. Overall, however, the Baltics appear to be more of a liability for NATO. A series of war games performed by the RAND Corporation predicted that the Baltics could be overwhelmed by Russia in a matter of 60 hours. This nullifies the strategic benefits of having these countries under protection, since if Russia chooses to, it could seize the military bases before NATO has a chance to respond. Also, deploying a large military force in the region as a preemptive defense measure by NATO would cause tensions, and in itself could be construed as an act of war that makes the Baltics practically impossible to defend. But because the Baltics are in NATO, they must be defended, and in theory cannot be abandoned, since doing this would make NATO irrelevant, especially after the recent lack of a response in Crimea. Considering these factors, it appears that the defense of the Baltics presents NATO with a hard-to-solve challenge, and the consequences of responding to Russian military could result in nuclear war. Therefore, we can conclude that the addition of the Baltics to NATO was most likely an oversight. The cause of this oversight? The assumption that post-Soviet Russia would not be a threat. This may have been true under the rulership of Gorbachev, Yeltsin, or Medvedev, but not Putin, who through his actions in Crimea has shown that Russia still has ambitions and still poses a major threat. In the current light of events, it is clear that the Baltics would have been better off not in NATO, but acting as buffer zones, same as Finland does today. A good buffer zone is a territory that does not side with either side and is completely neutral, posing no threat to anyone, as is the case of Finland. But since the Baltics are a part of NATO, they are not neutral, and as such, make Russia uncomfortable, thereby justifying them as a valid target of Russian hostility. As it currently stands, not much can be done about the situation, and as long as relationships with Moscow remain strained, the risk of war will remain. In either case, whether NATO chooses to respond to a Russian offensive or not, the Baltics will be overwhelmed, meaning the true benefits of being a part of NATO to them are arguably negligible. Therefore, overall, we can argue that the Baltics should not be in NATO.
I remember when I was 10 years old in Latvia,
An old friend of mine came up to me crying in distress, talking about how we were going to be screwed because Latvia was now hosting American military aircraft. He was terrified, and crying, and thinking he was going to die. Nothing came of it. Russia didn't invade us, and I didn't even think much of it at the time. So clearly NATO gives us lots of protection and possibly some advantages and leverage, but it's also possible that the Baltics have become a detonation device for something far worse. Most experts argue that an invasion of the Baltics is very unlikely, but also most experts did not think that Russia was going to invade Ukraine either, but they did, of course. Anyway, I find this a very interesting topic, and I'd like to cover more topics like this. So if you liked it, subscribe, because there's going to be more. See you later. Geoperspective out.